Hello, everybody. So today or tonight, whatever time you're listening to this, um, I'm going to do this segment is going or this podcast is going to be on the history of full preterism and Israel only. So I am going to be reading off a little bit of a script. So just keep that in mind if I kind of am looking into space or something. But I am gonna be using a little bit of a script that I've got because it's a lot of information and it's historical. So bear with me on that part. Um, anyways, we're gonna start on this. So the history of full preterism. This has been done to the best of my ability, and I think there are only two more people that have done any amount of historical uh, documentation on full preterism, which is very strange since all three are ex full preterists. But it is what it is with that. To my knowledge, there is nobody else that has been documenting the history. So here we go, though. So the history of preterism, as Roderick Edwards rightfully notes, I'm using Roderick here, uh, one of them. Uh, the history of preterism is a difficult thing to nail down since we really cannot point to an individual person that is solely responsible for this perspective. To be sure, there are many who claim that they are founders of views, including forms of preterism. But reality is often a different story. What makes the effort even more difficult is that there is a lot of historical revisionism that has come firsthand, and I know that has happened too. So, agree with Roderick there. So, it might serve the reader best to go somewhat in reverse when explaining the history of preterism, or more specifically, the movement called preterism, since preterism has developed theological position in more of a layman led shift. So, for a brief timeline of full preterism, it seems almost definitively, until shown otherwise, that the first documentation of full preterism was penned by Robert Townley in his book, The Second Advent of the Lord Jesus Christ, a Past Event. So Robert Townley, he lived from 1816 to 1894. And as far as anybody knows, until you can show me otherwise, and I'd be interested if you could find me something otherwise, right? Um, for history's purposes, right? Um, as far as anybody knows, though, that is the first document both. So he wrote his full preterist book in 1845, and in 1852, in a sermon in the Universalist Church of Charlestown, Massachusetts, on Sunday morning of September 26th, and I have the notes from it, the paper. He said, "We, on the contrary, fulfill everything by that magic phrase, the destruction of Jerusalem. But can we really and seriously refer these passages, which I quoted from Paul, to the destruction of Jerusalem? Can we truly say that the rejection of the Jews and calling of the Gentiles, all of their meaning, the meaning which was the thought in his mind when he wrote them? I must confess that I cannot." So while we do have, he is the first documented full preterist, he's also the first documented full preterist to have recanted his own position. So he is the first full preterist. He's also the first ex full preterist. So that's a little fun fact, I think. So anywho, though, I've read his book. It's very interesting. If you haven't read it and you're interested in this history, I can get you a link to it and you can look at it yourself. But so yeah, um, some do try to argue that Firmin Abu-Zet, who was born in 1679 through 1767, he was the author of Essai sur l'Apocalypse in 1730. Some argue that he was the first, but this is kind of unlikely because if you've gone and read it, he was more so seeking to discredit Revelation as part of the New Testament, and ultimately ended up recanting his position after Dr. Leonard Twells replied to it and said, and so once he replied to it, Firmin Abu-Zet said, Upon reading Dr. Twell's reply, Abauzet was so well satisfied and honorably wrote, though in vain, to stop the reprinting of his work in Holland. And I'm adding that to make mention because he also, like Talley, ultimately recanted his position. And so, this is just an interesting part of history. But I'm going to argue he's not a full preterist. And I think it's obviously so if you read him, because he's not taking the position that revelation and he's not taking the position that revelation is scripture. Like, he's taking that it's not part of the New Testament. So he, until he got, until Leonard Twells responded to him, he had this position, but he recants it eventually. So, it's not really a full preterist position. It's just more so he was trying to discredit revelation, right? So, I don't think that works for a full preterist position. So until then, it's got to be Robert Townley right now. Like, he's definitely one. So as far as preterism though, you get the Jesuit priest, Catholic priest Louis de Alcazar in 1554 through 1613, and he's responsible for the first formal preterist commentary. But he was what would be counted as a partial preterist today. He is obviously not a full preterist. So there you go with that. Of notable notice, though, like in the 1800s, we get quite a few of them that they give into like some very close full preterist. Like, it's very close to being a full preterist. So like James Stuart Russell, for example, he was essentially a full preterist. And he did not recant of his position. He wrote the Parousia, a critical inquiry into the New Testament doctrine of our Lord's second coming in 1878. Now, he does believe that there are things to be fulfilled in some sense, though, so he is not technically a full preterist. And you have, like, in 1891, you have Ernest Hampton Cook, which he's the writer of The Christ Has Come, and he shares similar concepts to Russell, right? Now, I will argue this. I will argue because I actually read it. So it seems to me that it's the case. John Humphrey Noyes, 1811 through 1886, is the author of The Greatest Secret in the World and The Berean. And to me, he is a full preterist. Like, he shares such similar views to Russell and Cook, but I need to look into it a little bit more. But so far, what I've found, he is a full preterist. And he's actually very interesting. And I think I'm going to do a whole podcast about him because he was the founder of the Putney Commune in 1836, which was formalized in 1844. And after a brush with the law for adultery, he founded what was called the Oneida Community. And this was established in 1848, which lasted until 1881, had a membership of 300 people, with various branch communities. It is now disbanded, and only the buildings and the silverware company live on. But this community was known for being a perfectionist sex cult under Noyes, and practiced things such as what Noyes referred to as male continence and complex marriage or shared marriage. And the children in the commune were raised non-traditionally by the community. They were not raised by their biological nor their individual family members. The children, upon reaching adolescence at the age of 14, were often made to engage in sexual relations with the older men and women in the commune. And it's safe to say Noyes was a seriously disturbing cult leader. But this is well documented. You can go look it up. And I'm probably going to do a whole thing on it because earlier some people didn't believe me that this existed, but it does, unfortunately. So anyways, as Roderick Edwards notes, and I think he might have got some of this from Wikipedia too, but I mean, Wikipedia also has other sources for this, by the way. So it's not anything against Roderick there, but Noyes' belief, he says, Noyes' belief that Jesus already came in 70 AD directed his actions of practicing what he called complex marriage. Noyes in the community did not practice monogamy, but rather with the notion that, quote, in the resurrection, no one is given to marriage, quote. The community practiced a form of polyfidelity or group marriage. So the adherents would take turns having consensual sex with different partners. There were no exclusive marriages of one man and one woman. Thus, in their minds, being consistent with their particular preterist belief that they were currently in the resurrection and that no one in the resurrection is married, at least not to one individual, they kept to that. And it was disbanded by 1879 after Noyes had fled to Canada over fears of arrest for statutory rape charges. So there you go. And another thing to note about this community, this cult, one of the members was Charles Guiteau, and he remained there for about 5 years. And this is a very interesting part of full preterist history because he is very interesting, and you'll see why in a minute. The woman of the community never consented to his participation in the complex marriage and often referred to him as Charles Get Out. He turned to practicing law from about 1866 to 1876, but upon failure and homelessness and even arrest, he soon returned to theological endeavors and began writing articles on preterism, publishing a book about preterism called The Truth. And when this failed, he turned his attention to politics and may have wrote a speech for President James Garfield and had the delusion that his own efforts were partly responsible for his win. This would ultimately lead Charles Guiteau to assassinate President Garfield in 1881. So Guiteau, in his autobiography, admits that he believed his preterist book would probably have a large sale on the account of notoriety of removing the president. This shows that beyond Guiteau's anger for not being appointed to his post, his more important mission was to advance, quote-unquote, the truth, his so-called titled book and his preterist ideas. So very interesting, actually, that this guy existed. So you kind of have the first full preterist to assassinate a president, a United States president. That's a weird accomplishment, but, you know, it is what it is. It's just an interesting history fact. It doesn't mean every full preterist is a one of those bad people, but, you know, it's a very interesting deal. So if you want more on that topic, if it interests you, I am going to do something on this, but you may find some key starter information on Wikipedia. You're not going to find on Preterist Archive anymore because that doesn't exist, which stinks because that was a very good source. And that was the second guy who did it, right? Todd. Todd did that. And man, it was a good website. And I wish it had kept being on, but that said, all the men listed under these notables are not traditionally seen as full preterist. Now, I would argue, though, that Noyes and Guiteau, they are. So, but Townley, unless otherwise, is likely the first documented full preterist. And this leaves full preterism to have started officially in 1845, recanted in 1852 after 7 years, and then various sects of people in the United States primarily that continued diving into this vein of thought that Christ came back in 70 AD would happen, you know. So you have many years because it's not until Max King in 1971 that full preterism really ever gains any trace or steam or traction in any sense. And it's not until Don Preston or Ed Stevens using the internet in the 90s to today that full preterism never gained any momentum that it has. So mostly thanks to various sites on the internet. It's the only reason this has gained any prominence. So given the history, one should question if full preterism is true, why is it taken until Townley and then 126 years until Max King and later on Ed Stevens and Don Preston for anyone to figure out that full preterism is true? How's virtually every single Christian since AD 70 managed to get it all wrong and managed to miss the quote-unquote truth about eschatology in the Bible? How's everyone been wrong for almost 2 millennia, but a very, very minor and select few throughout 2,000 years of history? Very, very wild. To push this question further, since it hasn't been until really one person in the 1800s, almost full preterist carried on the thought process in some aspect and then came into Max King in the 1970s to today until full preterism, like nothing happened. Like there was no traction whatsoever. So It took Abazet to Townley 115 years for someone else to come to a similar conclusion, only to both recant. And then you go 126 years later, you get Max King, and then you get 10 to 20 years under King enters Don Preston, William Bell, and Ed Stevens, who also come to the conclusion that Christ came back in 70 AD and all prophecy is fulfilled. So, it's kind of a interesting thought process there if you really think about it. So it seems like a long time for the truth, quote unquote, to come clear to someone else, does it not? So Roger Guterres does a lot of good work on this part. So he notes that the Preterist movement perhaps began to gain steam in earnest after the 1993 Covenant Eschatology Symposium held in Mount Dora, Florida. The event was sort of a watershed moment because it was the first time that Christians, and specifically the Reformed Christian scholars, would directly interact with the full preterist in person. When Max King and the other preterists in attendance would present, what they would present was a radical shift that moved so far away from the United View of Christian eschatology that it would be hard to see it as Christianity. And for the next 5 to 10 years, preterists would use the term paradigm shift to describe what it takes to accept the preterist view. However, in subsequent years, the term became an ironic negative in that it showed that whatever preterism is, it's not in the same vein as historical Christianity, much to some full preterist dismay, and attempts to claim it as part of Christendom. Edwards also notes that during the 1990s, preterism as a movement was defined by yearly conferences, usually attended by the same 150 people. So preterism also maintained a vocal presence on forums such as the audio chat platform called Paltalk and on Yahoo mailing lists. But perhaps the largest presence of preterists, at least online, resided on a now-defunct website called Planet Preterist, started by a Romanian immigrant named Virgil Vaduva, who was probably one of the most active and organizing people within the movement, holding yearly conferences, debates, and even streaming the gatherings online. He has since moved on from direct promotion on the movement and has tried his hand at politics and protesting police actions. So, interesting guy. So, Edwards notes that perhaps the three men who should be most credited or blamed for bringing full preterism into the 20th and 21st centuries are Max King, Edward Stevens, and Walt Hibbert, who spent much of the early days of the movement publishing books and pamphlets and trying to interact with mainstream Christian leaders, as noted in the Mount Dora, Florida conference. We would also add Don K. Preston to this list, who is probably the most popular of full preterists today. And I think that's probably true. So there are some existing full preterist churches, but they are typically small and stagnant. Fulfillment or completion of an event tends to cause the people to leave the bleachers and head for the exits and resume doing other things. This seems to be the case especially with the version of preterism that was espoused by Max King's son, Tim King. And I mean no offense by this, but it's just how it seems to be. Tim King morphed his dad's covenant eschatology into a trademarked version he called transmillennialism. From there, King tried to foster a social movement called Presence Ministries, modeled after Brian McLaren and Rob Bell's emerging church movement. But just like being postmodern, being post-church and post-Christianity means after church and after Christianity. So not a lot stuck with it, and it basically became defunct. So King was writing his books and pushing this all in the 1970s, back when dispensationalism was at its highest level of domination in the world of mainstream Christianity. And many who found King's work, they found it to be refreshing since they consistently dealt with constant date-setting dispensationalists who have always failed at the dates of the second coming. So, they kind of thought, oh, this is nice compared to that. So King's influences stuck mainly, though, within Churches of Christ denominations. But it affected often other more vocal preterists such as Edward Stephen, Don Preston, William Bell, and others. In fact, many of the early leaders within the preterist movement came from Churches of Christ under backgrounds. So I think that's probably accurate. I think almost anybody can agree on that it is mostly Church of Christ backgrounds that the preterist movement continues to this day on. It is kind of getting outside of that maybe, but that's arguable, obviously. And And this is probably because those denominations are usually restorationists. So those they believe that the church failed, so it needs to be restored. And so this ideology usually fits perfectly with the preterist premise that for 2,000 years the church has been wrong on eschatology. So King's that's kind of the way that it works with that idea. Like it kind of helps a little bit for them. So King's elder age did not lend him to online communication and promotion very well, so this was taken up by his sons. So Tim King, Mac's son, did most of the groundwork for his father in promoting his father's works, and that was true for a long, long time. But eventually, Doug King was the one that took up the mantle, and he does a different. He's not even a full preterist. He's a I don't know what you call it, new age, I guess. It's new age is basically what it is. So, yeah, that's Max King version of full preterism. So, that's what it morphed into, and King was into that too. So, Max was into that too. So, anywho, in the 2000s, David Green, Sam Frost, as you guys know him, Jason Bradfield, you all know him, two ex-full preterists. Other various promoters of full preterism became more prominent in this movement. Since Frost's abandonment of full preterism, there has really been no true scholar to date for full preterism. And in 2010, Don K. Preston, quote, resigned as minister of his preterist church he ran for 16 years. His stated reasons in his letter, it says, well, it's not a letter, it's actually a sermon. I guess you'd call it a sermon. It was recorded. He says, the quickest way to do this is just to simply say, I am resigning as the minister of this congregation. We started out as some 16 years ago, but with great hopes and dreams. And we've accomplished some great things, but all you have to do is look around this morning. We have not grown. Many of our younger couples have abandoned us. We had discussed the goal of one day reaching the point where we'd be able to hire another man, and I would be able to go into full-time in full seminar debate and book writing work. Our failure to grow obviously does not make it possible. So I am resigning, and in order to give the congregation the opportunity to hire someone that will be more focused and successful with the local evangelist work. So, end quote. So, full preterism has mostly seen nothing but failure upon failure when it comes to creating full preterist churches. And I guess of note, like Alan Bonner closed down the operations of Lift Church and became an atheist. So, I mean, that's kind of what's happened with all of these churches. Don Preston couldn't even keep his church together. So he just kept dying. So, and not all of them are completely dead, I guess. Like Michael Miano has a small church. I guess David Curtis still has one. And a few others may be the ones left with any form of a full preterist church actually operating and managing to keep their doors open. So, yeah, it's just how it goes. There are some more full preterists that could be listed, like say John Noe, perhaps. But as was claimed earlier, this is currently the best information historically that I have and what other people have wrote. So, and I'm trying at lengths to try and keep this as historically accurate as possible. But it is what it is. So this covers at least a very basic knowledge of the history of full preterism and its founders, quote unquote. And as I promised, I'm also going to do Israel only. So here you go with Israel only. So and I'm still working on this too, by the way. So I'm working on this all. If y'all got more information, let me know. The Israel only view that salvation or the promises of God were exclusively for ethnic Israel and not for Gentiles has zero historical or scholarly backing outside of groups like British Israelism and Black Hebrew Israelites. And these are the groups that they copy their arguments from. Mainstream biblical scholarship, both Jewish and Christian, have always recognized that the inclusion of Gentiles was part of the biblical narrative. Even within the Old Testament, you have examples like Ruth, Rahab, and the prophecies in Isaiah about the nations coming to worship God. And the New Testament does overwhelmingly affirm Gentile inclusion, especially in Paul's writings, Romans 9 through 11, Ephesians 2-3. So just like full preterism, the Israel-only position relies on eisegesis mostly, rather than exegesis, often ignoring and reinterpreting clear biblical passages that contradict it. But anywho, with that said, we're going to get into the history of this because, this is a history podcast. So, the first generation of Israel only. So, the first generation of Israel only was Rivers of Eden and David Hockner, or I think it's Donald Hockner. I'm sorry. And Don Hockner recanted, just to be clear. Rivers of Eden, I don't know what he's up to anymore. But yeah, so they read, and you can see this on angelfire.com. I have a link that I could send you if you want it. Just ask me and I'll give it to you. But you can see from their arguments and their writings, they talk about they're reading British Israelism, right? Rivers of Eden was under Ed Stevens, and Hockner was reading British Israelism. Rivers started to read it too. So they read these works. They did not agree with the racism, and I want to clarify that because in their writings, if you read their writings, they recant that regularly because they do not agree with the racism in it. But that all said, they used some of the arguments. So British Israelism was used and inserted into full preterism, and that formed the first generation of Israel only. So then on the next incarnation, you get, say, Corey Schultz and Jen Fishburne, who continued to take the arguments from the first generation of Israel only, and then they just started to insert not just British Israelism arguments, but also Black Hebrew Israelite arguments. So that's really the second generation. Not much going on there. At least from Jen Fishburne, not much going on there. But they added Black Hebrew Israelite arguments. So yay, right? So for the third and current incarnation of Israel only, Jason Acosta does not like to admit this, but he engaged in many conversations with all the listed people and is responsible for popularizing Israel only in the full preterist space. And I would call him third generation Israel only. And as of recently, all the incarnations of Israel only full preterism have been exclusive and claimed only biological Israelites were part of Israel. But Jason Acosta has begun to say this might be wrong. And so he's been making strides in Israel only that maybe it's more inclusive. Maybe non-biological Israelites did become part of Israel. So what comes out of this all? The next iteration of Israel only full preterism? It's yet to be determined. But anywho, so that is the history of full preterism. And what's up, Tristan? I see you on here. Yeah, so that is the history of full preterism, and so far Israel only. So, if you have any information for me, let me know, because I'm always adding to this. I'm always researching. So if you can find something that, and hey, even if it contradicts what I'm saying, because I would love to correct it, right? So let me know, and I'll change it. If y'all can find me proof and documentation, all of that, great. If you can find me someone before Robert Townley, that's great. Let me know. I don't think you're going to find it, but hey, I could be wrong. You might find it. You might be the first person to find it. So, yeah. So, yeah, thank you. And if you like this, sub, like, and I'm going to do one next time on the One Night Occult, because I think that one is a really interesting topic. So I kind of want to bring up full preterism sex cults in this next one. Yeah, so that one might be kind of fun, but I got to work on that one a little bit. So anyways, thank you. God bless you. And y'all have a good night, day, week, whenever you're listening to this. So thank you.